What's up, family, and welcome back to the channel. Now, bear with me for this one because my notes are a little jumbled here, but th- these have been in my notes probably for about 3 months now, maybe even four. But I really wanted to share these. I did that because my glasses look crooked to me. But I did wanted to share this particular conversation in our Permission to Think segment and series. And so yeah, we're going to talk about this. Before we jump in, like the video, subscribe to the channel, hit the alert notification bell, join our community, Patreon, YouTube, Discord, find us where you can. Consider volunteering, consider financially supporting, and check out our merch. All right. So in this Permission to Think segment today, I actually want to talk a little bit, and this, again, this might be a little scatterbrained, so bear with me here. But how atheism helped me kind of take control of my relationships. And when I say atheism, obviously I'm using atheism almost as somewhat like clickbaity, right? But also atheism in a sense of it's not disingenuous or inauthentic because it is atheism was the doorway for me, right? So the biggest hindrance in my ability to critically engage the world around me was my theism. You see how that makes sense? So, yes, while it is critical thinking that has actually helped me, atheism was the thing that removed the blockade that was preventing me from being able to employ those critical thinking skills in more areas of my life. And as others have stressed, it's not that believing in God just completely makes you not use critical skills or cognitive development or anything, or your cognitive skills rather. It is just that you begin to compartmentalize areas that you are less likely to use those skills. Does that make sense? I hope it does, because that was my reality. So there were certain things that I could do, and I could absolutely engage those things critically, but that's because I was giving myself permission to. When it came to areas of my life that I saw God as intimately intertwined with, there was less room to critically engage those areas. As a matter of fact, the more question marks that arose in those areas, the more likely I was to put God there. You know, some people call it God of the gaps. When it's on this level, I just call it God of the question marks, which is what happens for a lot of people. Questions that we can actually get the answers to, we let others convince us that no, that answer is already defined, and that answer is God. So, relationships was one of those areas. On this side, by the time I was deconstructing and fully deconverting, because honestly, yeah, I'm sure you've heard me say this before, I feel like my entire experience with Christianity, I was deconstructing because I was a digger. I was looking for the truth. I wasn't 100% convinced, nor did I feel like I had to be. I thought faith was the recipe. So I don't have to be convinced if I need faith, but that faith would lead me to a moment that would eventually convince me. And that never happened. But when I was deconverting, rather, I began to realize that not just one or two, but all of my relationships in my life were horribly imbalanced. And I'm not putting blame on anybody else for that. These, you will see by the end of the video, this is somewhat how I engaged relationships. But like, oh my goodness, they were horribly imbalanced. There's a story that comes to my mind. This one isn't in my notes. Again, I said I'll be a little scatterbrained. But when I was like 19, I don't even know if I was 19 because I hadn't moved to Jacksonville yet. Well, yeah, I had to be 19. When I was around 19, I had a little teen radio show that I was doing at the time. Wasn't nothing major. It was like on an AM channel. And honestly, the guy that ran it, I kind of think he was a crook, you know. Yeah. But there was a lady that I met much older than me, and I ended up interviewing on the show. We became friends for quite a while, and I mean good friends, nothing inappropriate, which I don't know how to define that. But we were friends for a long while. We're not today, but so much so that even me, I was this young teenage person, but you can kind of see. I'm hoping if you've interacted with me, you can probably kind of tell that I'm one of those people who people have accused of having an old soul my entire life. So people have always felt comfortable sharing with me and things of that nature, venting and opening up. So she shared with me this story about, how she used to be married to one person, and then she ended up having an affair with her pastor, which was a large church pastor, mega church pastor, and about how she eventually felt bad about it and went to tell the pastor's wife, and the pastor's wife was like, well, honey, you ain't the first and you not gonna be the last. And she was talking about dealing with these just dealing with the aftermath of that. And this was years later. The time she's telling me the story, probably 15, 20 years had transpired. I don't know, had passed by that time. So, but she's sharing this because she's still dealing with a lot of the trauma from being involved in a situation like that, especially with the complexity of church and, not expecting the pastor's wife to respond that way. I guess kind of hurt her feelings, which kind of dealt with this somewhat, other side of you kind of wanted her to be upset and punish him and, kind of things like that. But anyway, so just maybe a year later, I was going through something in a relationship and I wanted to call somebody for advice because this lady who was someone who had always called me for advice and has always shared with me, you know, everything that was going on in her life. I remember calling her, and this is just a random example. I remember calling her and saying, "Hey, I'm going through something right now. Do you have a few minutes to talk?" And she was like, "I'm busy right now. I got to go." And just hung up. And we never talked about it again. And again, I'm not blaming her for that. She may have been busy. But what I now realize in hindsight is that I was the type of person that no matter who you were, no matter what the relationship was, if you needed my attention, I was going to give it to you. And I'm not saying that was healthy. You know what I'm saying? I'm not necessarily saying what she did was right, but I'm not saying it was wrong either. What I now know is that I don't know what was going on the other side of that phone, So I don't even give myself permission to jump to those conclusions. But what I did do was start to understand that, hey, bruh, other people engage life and take liberties that you don't feel comfortable taking, and you need to figure out why, you know. And so I did. I did figure out why. Like I was not clingy, and man, God damn it, I'm about to go down a rabbit trail. Okay, so when I was younger, I didn't always, understand the behavior of other people and why they felt like they needed to do things and didn't. Like I remember relatives would get upset with me because they'd ask you like, "Hey, what do you want?" And I'm like, "I don't know what that even means. What kind of shoes do you want?" And in my mind, literally as a child, in my mind, it was like, "What does it mean to want shoes? I mean, why should I care what logo is on them? Why should I care what color they are?" And this used to frustrate people with me as a kid, especially in my community, where there sometimes is a high sense of materialism, and there is almost an expectation for the children to be people who just want, and want. And even to this day, I'm just not that person. I don't have a lot of preferences, and also I don't like the question, "What do you want?" if it's not backed by "I can get anything that I want." I'm more of a person like, "Hey, what do we have? What can we afford? What can we get?" Because like, "Hey, what do you want to eat?" "Well, I want to eat crab legs." "Well, we can't afford crab legs." "Well, why did you ask me? What do you want?" But anyway, the point is, growing up, I ended up having to train myself to develop attachments to people to feel normal, because I didn't have these attachments. I had a high sense of empathy for other people. But I didn't feel that I had to behave in certain ways, that I had to do certain things. And so it was very frustrating for me during those early years. And so I eventually kind of learned how to train myself and conform myself to do what was expected as opposed to kind of what I thought. And that actually is how I ended up building relationships, for the first 28 years of my life. It's just doing what is expected, point blank, period, which did give me a very large network. I had a large network of friends, of families, and just to be quite frank, it was absolutely useless. And you'll kind of see why. So I started realizing. So the first thing was I was, deconversion. I decided I was through with imbalanced relationships, and I was kind of reviewing my life and looking at how my relationships had, been off balance. And one of those areas that was incredibly off balance was my mentors. And I've had, I want to say, okay, let me see if I can. I'm gonna see if I can. I don't want to name everybody. Well, I'll name them. My earliest mentor in the Christian faith was Marcus Tankard Whiters. Um, yeah, that's the earliest. That's when I had just moved back from DC back to Dothan, which is where I am now. Met him through school and church. And then after that, it would have been Sam Seals, who was not a Marcus wasn't a pastor either. Sam was not a pastor. He's an associate pastor today, I think. But he was just one of the ministers at the church, at one of the larger churches that I went to in this area. Um, Sam Seals, and then also David Pizzamini, who was the pastor of that church. David was never really my mentor, but he was my pastor, and I loved that guy until he died. But yeah, he was cool to me. Now, apparently, he was a jackass to a lot of other people, but hey, that's between them. I don't know. Let me stop. And then after that, I started kind of separating from more localized pastors and start reaching out for different types of mentors. And so from there, my next mentor was Eddie Long, out of Lithonia, Georgia, who was also died. Damn, is all my mentors dead? No, it's just two. Okay. Eddie Long. After Eddie, there was Ron Carpenter, who used to be in um, South Carolina. He's in California somewhere now. John Gray is in his old building, who has recently changed his church name. They were Relentless Church. You remember John Gray? He was the pastor that came. He actually originally comes from Eddie Long's church, and I don't want to say originally, but he was at Eddie Long's church, and then he went to Joel Osteen's church, and then they gave him a big send off, and him and Ron Carpenter apparently had a deal that ended up falling apart horribly. And then somehow John Gray cheated on his wife, got caught, and then used church money to buy her a very, very expensive vehicle. And yet people still call him pastor and still flock to the church. So, hey, there you go. I guess it takes one to know one. Is that, I don't know. So, but I started realizing, oh, yeah. And then after Ron Carpenter, it was Mike McClure Jr. and Dr. R.A. Vernon, really at the same time, because Dr. Vernon was Mike's mentor, and Mike was kind of my mentor at the time because of proximity. He was closer to me. He was also in Alabama. Dr. Vernon was all the way in Cleveland, which were trips that I would take as a very poor person. But I started realizing that many of my mentors and many of the people who were giving me advice were not actually properly analyzing and evaluating the details of my circumstances. And so I remember leaving a lot of these relationships incredibly unfulfilled because just the advice sessions were so lackluster, and I was like, damn, I give better advice than this to my members. How do you have 25,000 people showing up? I don't understand. Is this what you're telling these people? But what I realized is that they weren't even trying to analyze or evaluate. In many cases, that was something that they had already convinced themselves or settled that they couldn't do, that they weren't capable of doing, or that it wasn't in their purview. It wasn't their job. Their job was to sense what the Lord was saying, to sense what God was doing, to sense how the Holy Spirit was moving, which ultimately meant they were just responding to triggers. And there are all types of triggers in life. There are social triggers, There are emotional triggers, there are religious triggers, but triggers, much like superstition, are just shortcuts. They're things that we can latch onto without having to further investigate before responding. And so if they just heard me say a trigger thing, so if you say, you know what, I've been struggling with my finances lately. Oh, what you need to do is sow a seed. What you need to do is tithe, you know. And so it's those type of things where I realize, oh man, yikes, even some of the people that I'm entrusting to give me advice aren't able to. And just to kind of highlight the mistake that I was making because of my theism and my superstition was making that is because you seem to be qualified on preaching this book. I was equating you preaching this book, meaning that you must be an intellectual, very reflective, very intuitive, very understanding, empathetic person. And that is a illogical jump. It is absolutely illogical to think that because someone can preach the Bible or that someone can even teach the Bible, that they are qualified to help you navigate your life. And even in the last few years of me pastoring, I became absolutely resistant to doing marriage counseling for this very reason. Because I realized that, wait a minute, what about me preaching this book actually makes you think that I am qualified to help you navigate your marriage? And what I realized is that many of the people who come to pastors for marital counseling do so because they don't take counseling seriously. All right. Yeah. Man, I didn't mean to get into that. But because they were just responding to these triggers, what happens when you're this type of person is you're going to prioritize what you think God wants over the visible and demonstrable best interest of the people involved. So when I went through a divorce when I was deconverting, and I called my mentor and was trying to talk to him about it. It wasn't a conversation that he could engage because the moment he heard that I was considering divorce, the trigger for him was God hates divorce stuff. And outside of certain parameters, God hasn't given you permission to divorce. And what he couldn't understand at that moment is I wasn't asking God's permission. What I was doing was seeking someone who was living in this life on this earth who had had experiences here. I was hoping that that person could be able to pull from some of those experiences and share something with me that would be helpful regardless of whether my decision aligned with his theology. Of course, I found that that was very difficult for a lot of believers. Very difficult. Um, so these are just some areas, and again, I told you this one would be a little scatterbrained. Um, I started realizing that I had done more for the kingdom of God than God, His people, or His kingdom had ever done for me. The more and more I started to pay attention to these things, I realized that I was very much um, engaged or entangled, if you will, with a false balance. And according to the Bible, a false balance is an abomination unto the Lord. Right? It is. Um, I was in this place where I just kept making faith deposits, only to have to keep making withdrawals from myself to fulfill, to make good on these faith deposits. I was being more attentive to other people than they were being attentive to me. And a part of that is because I had not made them being attentive to me a priority of the relationship. As a matter of fact, in my mind, those were things. No, these people are too busy. The very way that they were trying to give me advice is the way that I expected the advice to come. It wasn't until later that I realized that I was the fool. I mean, they were fools too, but in my life, I'm the fool, right? Because I was expecting the Lord to just reveal to them something up until the moment of deconversion. When especially when dealing with my mentors and dealing with other people in the faith, I'm expecting the anointing to just show you something. I'm expecting that God showed you what my heart really is. I'm expecting that God showed you these things. I'm not holding you accountable to knowing. I'm not holding you accountable to paying attention. And so for years, I would allow people to treat me as if I would allow people to treat me as if I was somebody that I wasn't, based off of the ideology that God may have revealed something to them that I did not know about myself. The foolery. Okay? Um, it was a false balance. And so eventually I separated myself from this type of toxic trauma, from what I often call a trauma bond, you know, and separating myself from that enabled me to take inventory of all the relationships in my life, realizing very quickly that my network was dysfunctional because my relationships were not purposeful. And so, growing up culturally religious, there are certain ideals that you have about life. And one of those ideals is that God gave you your family. This is why we have sayings such as blood is thicker than water. It's because God gave you your family. God assigned you to your mother. God assigned you to your father. And eventually you begin to expand that beyond the immediate family or the classical family, especially if you become hyper spiritual and it becomes God assigned you your pastor. God assigned you your mentor. Like all of these things are given to you, which, if you're not careful, removes your choice from the relationship. And I didn't necessarily mean to hit this note, but this is actually a real issue in a lot of urban churches where there are people who are submitting themselves to somewhat modern day slavery to pastors because of this belief that God assigned me this pastor. There are people who will allow themselves to experience all types of abuse at the hands of their leaders because they don't believe God has given them permission to leave that relationship. Hmm? So, on one hand, it does remove for a lot of people, not everybody, but it does remove for a lot of people that the right to make their own choices about relationships if you believe that God assigned these relationships. And it also robs you of the ability to define your relationships or assign purpose to those relationships. So for years, I grew up calling two people mother and father who actually did not try to be mother or father. And I carried the burden up until I was about 30 of being the good son, the empathetic son, the understanding son, the considerate son, the son who always calls and checks in. I wore that burden because I thought it was my responsibility. God, this is good. I thought their behavior towards me was a reflection of them needing me to do more. So maybe she's not treating me like her son because I'm not being son enough. Whew. It's definitely how I felt about my father. Maybe because I'm not into shoes. you know, that I'm not son enough for him. Maybe because I'm not into playing sports or watching sports, that I'm not son enough for him. This was my relationship with everybody in my life. Maybe I'm not this enough from, and so I would find ways, which is why to this day, like I'm not complaining, which there's no tears. Now, if y'all have met me, y'all know I'll cry when it gets emotional. There's no tears for this for me because this was a happy lesson for me to learn. But today I'm a chameleon. I can be in any environment and you really won't know how I really, 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 really feel. Hell, I might not even know. I'm just that damn ambiguous. Yes, I am. But I've learned how to conform to many different environments because that's what I felt that it's on me. Something's wrong with me, and I kind of sometimes refer to that as my orphan syndrome. Growing up the way that I did, you feel disposable, you feel dispensable, and if you want people to keep you around, you have to conform. You know, Whew, that's heavy, right? That's heavy. That's heavy. Um, and what I realized is that it wasn't God who was choosing my relationships. It was convenience. My relationships with others were solely based on proximity, not purpose. Convenience, not community. You know? So it was just because I was born in this house that I have to make it work with these people. And so I have to alter myself in all of these different ways to try to feel normal with these people, or I'm going to be rejected forever. Because if the people who you were born into can't receive you, then nobody will receive you. These were the subconscious anecdotes and cliches that I had bought into. And I was actually living in a place where I was actually afraid to pick or be intentional about my relationships. So I wasn't doing relationships on purpose. I actually felt that it would have been wrong of me to have standards for my relationships. Now, I haven't felt this way in a while. My standards have actually increased quite a bit since then. Um, the last conversation I had with my father was a conversation where I let him know that, hey, you were just a guy fucking around and got somebody pregnant. For whatever reason, you didn't make a decision to become a father then, and I think I was 30 at the time, and you've had 30 years to do so. I get that you're not father material. And for the type of life that I live, I can't have anybody in that position that's not going to fulfill that function. And because of the time gap, and there's a little bit of my jackassness right here. And I don't mean to be a jackass. It's just kind of the clarity that I view my life in. Because of the time gap, that's no longer even a position that I need to be occupied. You know, we're literally no longer hiring for that position. We have downsized that department. you know, and I mean that with all love. Like I want I don't want to say I want. See, that word is weird to me, but I'd hope the best for both of my parents. I hope that they have a wonderful, beautiful life. But what I know based off of their behavior, even their words to me at many times, is that parenting is something they never chose to do. And so I chose to no longer hold them hostage to that and to separate myself from false expectations. I was actually afraid to be intentional about my relationships. Here's the thing that I don't know if any of you caught. I was afraid of having a choice in my relationships. I was afraid of being able to say that this relationship is not beneficial for me. I was afraid of being able to say that this relationship might be harmful for me. Because from the time that I was a child to the time that I was a full grown ass man in ministry, there was always people there to say things like, well, that's always going to be your mother. Well, you can't forget that's your father. Now you got to remember that's the man of God. Don't touch my anointed. And so finally I'm at a place where like, I don't give a fuck what their label is. No. Titles don't move me. Even as a child, and that was another thing, I didn't understand the respect your elders thing. Like I don't you being here a long time and you doing something useful with that long time are two different things. You know, you being here a long time and you actually making an impact on other people positively, two different things. You don't you don't get respect out of tenure. What? No, ain't no tenure in life. Stop that. But anyway, um, I didn't want to be judgmental, and that was one of the things that I was super duper afraid of. I was super duper afraid of judging people. I was super duper afraid of, like, oh no, I don't want to be the person who thinks this person isn't going to do this, and then ooh, they change. And now I realize, like, it's not up to me to determine who's going to change and when they're going to change. And none of the relationship decisions that I make today are final. I don't even know what a final decision is until there's death. And even then, there may be some fucking question marks. You understand? So I no longer even have that fear. I no longer have that concern. I'm not concerned if someone's going to think, oh, Darante's being judgmental. I am likely more judgmental today than I ever was as a believer. Especially when it comes to my relationships. And it's not that I have a judgment against the other person. I have a judgment of whether or not me and the other person will work well together. I have a judgment of whether or not this will be conducive for my life right now. And I could be right or wrong. I have completely released myself from the pressure of being always right so that I can freely make decisions that I feel are best for me and then have the freedom and the sanity to investigate those decisions if they go wrong. And to say, oh, okay, so you thought this person was going to be bad. And dang, it turns out they're a really good person. How did you make such a fucked up decision? That's how I live my life. I don't expect myself to be perfect. So I am free from the stagnation that kind of caused, the paralyzation that typically creates. I no longer I am in a place now where I no longer force myself to stay in relationships for the sake of niceties. I no longer um, put myself in relationships with others who won't meet the standard of relationship that I'm meeting out. You know what I'm saying? And actually now I'm more vocal about all relationships that I'm in. So, and this will probably annoy a lot of you, but it's me. I'm not saying you have to do it. Almost every relationship that I have in my life, we have to sit down and talk about what this relationship means. Like almost everyone. And I'm not saying we got to sit down and write out a proposal or anything, which I'm not against that. I like clarity, and so like it doesn't offend me at all. But I treat almost all my relationships like business relationships at this moment, only in the sense because I realized that I took my business, the things that I do in business, so seriously. I treat those things so sacred. And I realized it's because they were important to me, and there were a lot of things on the line, and I was like, oh well, why don't you treat all your relationships like that? And I was like, oh well, I had some superstitious reasons as to why I wasn't before, but now, like, nope. Let's talk about it. Who's gonna do what? What do we do for each other? What is the value that we get out of this relationship? And sometimes conversations like this are difficult for people, especially if it's not, an intimate relationship or a romantic relationship, because you're like, oh, what type of question is that? What do we do for each other? But when you see the amount of friendships that break down because somebody thought somebody was going to do something that was never expressed, you know? So let's just say you have a family member or something that dies, and and your BFF or whatever, they don't call, and that whole relationship breaks down because it was never clarified. Hey, I'm the type of person, if something traumatic happens, I need my friends to call. It was assumed that this is something everybody wants. And that's just not the case. There are some people, when they go through hard times, they don't want to be called, touched by anybody for a few days. And maybe that friend was thinking that's what you needed. But because it wasn't clearly communicated in advance, those things happen. Now, many times people are healthy enough to work through those. But unfortunately, I've seen a lot of relationships fall apart, whether they be friendships, romantic relationships, business relationships, whatever, because we are afraid of clarity. And for me, I realized I was afraid of clarity for two things. Number one, I was absolutely terrified of confirming that what I thought people may have thought about me is really what they thought about me, you know? And I was afraid of getting clarity because I was afraid that it would lead to further dissonance between myself and my theism. I think that's brought me to the conclusion of this. I hope I've said something that is of value, of interest, maybe even slightly entertaining. But this was definitely a journey for me. Now, and I think you've seen some of this in the video I did on my problem with forgiveness. I'm not saying you don't need to forgive. Not saying that at all. I don't forgive. I don't. But when I say I don't forgive, I mean I don't have a need to forgive. I don't hold people to events. I don't hold people to their past. I don't hold people hostage. If you did something, you did it. If you changed, you changed. I don't need your apology for you to change, you know? So, not to say I don't accept apologies, but I'm also not the person who's like, oh no, this person didn't apologize to me, so it ain't gonna never be right. Like we went through something years ago. My wife and I, one of our family members, like literally tried to assassinate our character. Really, one of my wife's family members. Yeah, I was about to say something smart about my family, but um, and it was very difficult, and my wife wanted to restore that relationship with that person, and she was wondering how I would feel about it, and I was just like, oh, I don't care, I don't hold that person to that. What they did was definitely ugly. It was definitely wrong. But I've lived long enough to know that people are people. And the longer you are around people, people are going to do things that absolutely piss you off. I'm not judging your life whether you said something to me after that magically washes that away. I'm just judging your life by your ability to interact moving from that point. And even then, I'm not even judging your life. I'm judging whether or not I want to interact with that. So being able to critically engage the world around me has done wonders for my relationships and the way that I engage relationships. And I think the people that are in relationships with me today get the benefit of that because they get a version of Darante that is 100% clear, who's going to articulate how he feels, going to articulate what he understands, and is going to create space and room for you to do the same thing. Because I have spent my whole life being attentive to people, and I'm not going to stop that. That's a part of who I am. I don't consider that a weakness for me. I consider that maybe one of my superpowers, if you will. Um, but at the same time, I'll create space in my relationships and the safety in relationships for people to be able to do the same for me because that's what I need out of the relationship. Whatever the utility of it is, what I need is that we're both going to be attentive to whatever it is that we're both expecting to get out of this relationship. Thank y'all for hanging out with me. If you haven't already, like the video, subscribe to the channel, hit the alert notification bell, and do all of that other good stuff. Until next time, keep rising, stay progressive, and stay beautiful. I'll holla.